We have a great lineup, and I'm excited to hear the four presentations. We will have four presentations today, each about 15 minutes in length. Then at the end, we will have time for Q&A. So if you have a question, please use the live chat feature to submit your question, and I'll try to keep a log of those and give those to the presenters after all four presentations have finished. So with that, I want to introduce our first presenter today. Adam Bibler from the Department of Housing and Urban Development is going to present estimating HUD-assisted household employment by industry through matched ACS data. Adam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Please bear with me while I share my screen here. Okay, so hopefully people are now seeing my slides. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
I'll take that as a good sign. So again, my name is Adam Bibler. I work in HUD's office of what we call PD&R, Policy Development and Research. My main day job is actually to calculate a lot of operating parameters for the department. So these are things like fair market rents, which I think a later presenter is going to discuss. Also, HUD's estimates of area median family income and income limits, which determine eligibility for housing assistance. The common thread for a lot of these parameters is use of ACS data. So my team and I have developed a lot of expertise in ACS data over the years, and that allows us to tackle related research using census data, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. So in case you're not familiar with how HUD programs operate, there are a wide variety of programs in the department, but the big three are rental assistance programs that collectively serve over 9 million people in over 4 million low-income households. And HUD does not administer its programs directly. Instead, HUD oversees the operations of local agencies, either public housing agencies or property owners. These entities conduct the day-to-day operations, including determining eligibility and seeing the ongoing operations of the program. However, HUD receives the administrative data that the local entities collect, and for a number of years, HUD has shared these administrative data with the Census Bureau. That's something that our moderator, Sean, actually played a large role in, so if you have more questions about the history, maybe he can chime in about that. But that has facilitated the research that I'm here to talk about today. So this administrative data that HUD collects includes obviously demographic data and total household income, because that is what, as I said, determines eligibility. It also includes information about the source of income, so whether the income is from wages or benefits or a business and so on. So we know from this administrative data that about a fifth of HUD-assisted households have wages, so they are working and still in need of housing assistance. And under program rules, households are required to pay 30% of their income towards their rent, and then the government subsidy makes up the remainder of the cost of their rental housing. So as a result of this, program costs are sensitive to what's going on in the economy. If tenants are losing their jobs or suffering other income losses, then they are allowed to recertify their eligibility for assistance and contribute a lower amount based on their new income, and the government subsidy will increase. So this graph is looking specifically at costs within the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and we can see that costs have risen during recessions, not exclusively during recessions, but there is a spike in each of these past three recessions as tenants suffer negative income shocks and then are eligible for increased assistance. So COVID was kind of a unique scenario in that everybody knew there was a recession happening in real time, unlike some other recessions when it only became apparent once labor market data started rolling in. Due to the nature of shutting down businesses, we knew that a lot of people were going to be subject to losing their jobs. And it was also unique in that it was the labor market effects of the downturn varied differently by industries. So here I've arbitrarily shown the difference between legal services as an industry that was not particularly hard hit by the March 2020 COVID-induced recession, versus accommodation and food services that had a much sharper drop and that remained depressed relative to the pre-COVID employment levels throughout 2020 and into 2021. So it's an open question. It was an open question going into this pandemic of what type of exposure does the HUD-assisted household portfolio have to this recession? Because even though we know the overall income levels that show that HUD-assisted households are quite low and have some wage income, we don't know what type of industries they worked in from HUD's administrative data. However, the ACS asks about what the respondents' industry and occupation are. So we can look at the ACS data matched with the HUD administrative data to determine what type of industries our assisted households work in. And the way we do this, some of the mechanics happening behind the scenes here are that the Census Bureau has assigned a person identification validation system identifier called a PIC to each person in HUD's administrative database based on the social security numbers, dates of birth, and names. And these are also assigned to the ACS microdata so that we can link the two databases. Additionally, HUD assigns a master address file identification code to the housing unit in question. So both in the ACS and in the HUD administrative data contains information about where the unit is and the address, and that results in this MAF ID as it's known. So we adopt two linking strategies because of the nature of HUD's programs. In the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the assistance is tied to the household. So we identify households that are in both the HCV program and the ACS microdata and link those using the PIC. For the public housing program and the project-based rental assistance programs, the assistance is tied to the housing unit. So we instead link that to the ACS microdata using the MAF ID. What this means is that some of the respondents in the ACS data that we're identifying might not actually be the same respondents who were participating in the program at year end, because our administrative data is as of the year end each year, and the ACS is conducting on a rolling basis. So someone living in public housing in the beginning of the year might have responded to the ACS and then moved out, and then a different person would move in. However, that doesn't really change the nature of the results. It just changes, the literal definition of a results for the public housing program and project-based rental assistance program, where the results that we're going to see are persons living in HUD-assisted household, not necessarily persons who are living there and took the ACS. So what we're trying to see from all this is what type of industries HUD-assisted households actually worked in, and a ranking of those industries. So as we can see here, just under 400,000 people across all HUD programs worked in restaurants and food services. The next highest industry was elementary and secondary schools, but that was much lower at 150,000, going down through home health care services and all the way to outpatient care centers. So this is really interesting. Obviously, restaurants and food services were a particularly hard-hit industry by the COVID-induced recession. So interesting results right off the bat. However, we want to know, what should we expect from HUD costs relative to what's going on in overall employment income. So you need to know not just the ranking here, but are HUD-assisted households overrepresented compared to workers in general in these industries or not? So for the next slide, we look at the industry share of assisted person employment for each of these industries, and then compare that to the industry share of total employment from the raw BLS current employment statistics data. So we see that, as you might expect, given that it's a relatively low wage industry, HUD-assisted households are overrepresented in restaurant and food services by about 1.5 at 12%, just under 12% to just under 8%. They're even more represented in the next two biggest industries, elementary and secondary schools and home healthcare services. And on the flip side, you have industries in which they are underrepresented, like construction and hospitals. So that, to us, this implied that the potential for increased costs associated with the recession was higher than what you would look at if you just tried to model what the typical worker would experience in terms of lost income from the recession. We were also interested in knowing, do these rankings and shares of industry, do these shares of employment by industry vary across HUD programs? So on this slide, we're looking at the breakdown of HUD programs. And we can see that it really doesn't vary in broad strokes. If you were to list the top 20 programs for each of these industries, they would vary slightly in their positions, but not really in terms of the big picture here. And that's kind of interesting too, because there is some notable differences in the demographics in public housing versus the other programs where public housing residents tend to be older. But of course, this is just restricted to the working portions of each program. So the working age populations seem to be pretty similar. And this slide looks at the wages by these industries. So overall, the average wage for working households in across all HUD-assisted programs is just under $16,000 for 2021. So you can see that the average of these industries is in line with that average, coming from the ACS data here. But there is there is some variation by industry. So restaurants and food services just at over $12,000 per year, quite low compared to hospitals where the average wage was above $25,000. So that's interesting to keep in mind, particularly in conjunction with the earlier slide that showed that restaurants and other food services was the largest share of employment. And so, because this is research that we were doing in real time with COVID, trying to get a sense of where we were. Since then, we now know what the actual impacts have been on program costs. So we see that 2020 did have the sharpest increase in program costs of the past decade, but it's not perhaps as high as you would have expected, and that's of course because of the large scale stimulus that took place. So maybe it is still higher than you would expect because the stimulus was so large. It seems like that stimulus was not large enough to totally insulate increased costs from the department in terms of the expanded unemployment benefits and direct transfers of the stimulus checks. But kind of interesting, more research to tease out the exact nuances of costs there, but I think this contributes in part to that. So what were the challenges in doing this? The biggest challenge, well, maybe not the biggest challenge, but one of them was that the industry codes used by the Census Bureau in the ACS microdata were not the standard NAICS, North American Industry Code, something. And that's a little bit puzzling to me. So I did sort of build a crosswalk and use that in my work, but I know the PUMS does have the NAICS code, so there might be another version of the ACS microdata within the integrated research environment that I just wasn't able to get my hands on at the time. So this was my kind of first effort working behind the Suitland firewall, doing work like this. So there is a learning curve. If any of you have done an effort like this, you know about that. But I think that's also why doing this kind of research is worthwhile, because it makes the next project you do that much more streamlined. There was one other sort of analytical point that I didn't mention here, which is that we do reweight the household level or the person level weights, to make sure that the total number of people we are finding from the ACS matches up to the known totals from our administrative data of participants in the program. So that resulted in a slight scaling down of the weights, but I think it was actually pretty close and was relatively minor. So what are the next steps for this type of research? It's something that I think is worthwhile to look at over time, the industry shares, to see if they're evolving. I showed data from ACS 2019 here. Obviously, we're up through 2021 now. The first track at this looked at ACS 2018, actually, and there weren't large differences from 2018 to 2019. However, if you go all the way back to our industry slide here, you can see warehousing and storage is in the 19th place there. That actually was not in the top 20 in 2018. So you can kind of see the rise of Amazon and shipping services as a major employer for HUD-assisted households, which is kind of interesting. And then we are also interested in other applications of the matched ACS HUD data, including or beyond that, also other census data sources. For example, I and some of our other colleagues have looked at matching the ACS admin data with the COVID pulse survey. We looked at how well HUD-assisted households were getting vaccinated based on the responses to that survey. So there is definitely a lot more research that can be done with this match data. And
Adam, one more minute.
Sure, I think I'm done. Yeah, just to point out there that this is really an exercise in data matching. So at least some of you had interest in that beyond just the housing component to it as well. So thank you, Sean, and thank you to the conference for having me here today.
All right. Thanks a lot, Adam. Appreciate that presentation. It's a topic near and dear to my heart, and it's just awesome to see, more progress being made with that match data. All right. So next up, we have a presentation entitled "Demonstrating the Need for Implementing Small Area Fair Market Rents to Reduce Racial Segregation in the Baltimore Metro Area." And I think we have a tag team here of Cheryl, Musab, and Tanika doing the presentation. And just clarifying one thing I mentioned before, if you do have a question, can you please put it in the Q&A, not the live chat. Although I am keeping my eye on both, so if you do put a question in the live chat, it's okay. But please put them in the Q&A if you can. And I'll turn it over to our next group of presenters.
All right, thanks. So while Musab's pulling up our slides, I'd just like to say hello. Thanks for joining us, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Cheryl Knott. I'm the Assistant Director for the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance at the University of Baltimore. And so I'm here today with Musab Ibrahim and Tanika Richardson from the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, where we'll be talking about some research and also a dashboard that we've been developing, and all looking at how adopting small area fair market rents in the Baltimore metro area would look like, and these implications for addressing concentrations of housing voucher usage in Black middle market neighborhoods. So here we go. We've got our slides. So again, thanks everyone for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Musab for the next couple slides.
Thanks, Cheryl. And I just want to confirm if you all can see the slides right now.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So thanks for the introduction, Cheryl. So just to give a few some background and introduction, our funding opportunity was from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that awarded over 24 grants to look at data to improve community conditions shaped by structural racism. As the lead organization, the Maryland Center on Economic Policy advances innovative policy ideas, fostering broad prosperity, and helping Maryland be the standard bearer for responsible public policy. We're a member of the State's Priorities Partnership, and we produce research, analysis, strategic communications, public awareness, and grassroots alliances to promote robust debate about the policy choices that Marylanders face. And our technical assistance partner, Cheryl, who just introduced herself, they are from the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, otherwise BNIA. They focus on community indicators to improve quality of life of Baltimore's neighborhoods. They're also a member of the NNIP network, and they're producing open data research and policy recommendations. So our research essentially looked at the Housing Choice Voucher program in Baltimore City. And as the previous presenter mentioned, it's one of the nation's largest federal rental assistance programs, and assists over 5 million people, and including 2.2 million low household incomes. Despite its massive reach, unfortunately, only 1 in 4 households that qualify for housing assistance receive it due to inadequate funding. In Baltimore, while there are more than 17,000 households who have an access to a voucher, more than 23,000 are on the waiting list, and the average wait time to get a voucher is about 14 to 15 months in Baltimore City. And so what this has done is essentially over time, since the 2008 housing crisis, the financial crisis of 2007, many homes were sold for like foreclosures, many homes went underwater, and it essentially these homes became very low income. And so what we've seen in our research is that the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the voucher holders tend to cluster in these neighborhoods. And what we found is that it's led to artificial inflation of existing rental prices in these middle market neighborhoods. So basically what that means is the rent burden by these people who live there, which are, a good amount of them are voucher holders, they're paying more than 30% of their fair share on their rent. And while, as we know, as the voucher program states, it's supposed to cap their income, their rental spending at 30%. So we're seeing some sort of a paradox going on where the places that they cluster is pushing up rental prices. So in consulting with some stakeholders and other folks who were aware of this topic, aware of this issue, we sort of drew a couple of common themes as to why this is going on. One big thing was that the city has substandard housing, which puts people into a narrow range of communities. The higher opportunity neighborhoods tend to be out of the reach of a person with a voucher due to the payment ceiling.
Hey, Masad, can I pause you for a second, please? We're having some audio issues trying to hear you. You're being asked if you have any other applications on your computer open, if you could close them, and we'll see if that helps improve the audio connection. Your slides are coming through just fine.
Okay, sorry, one sec. Okay, how do I sound now?
That is a lot better. Let's go with that.
Okay, sorry for that you basically didn't hear all of what I just said, but I'll just pick up where I left off. So the program tends to steer voucher recipients to certain neighborhoods, and this is the main reason for this has to do with landlords and the rent ceiling and the relationship between that. As I mentioned before, the voucher program can be adequate, which could also lead to long wait times and compounding the housing needs. And one other thing we found is that so in these middle market neighborhoods, we've seen a lot of homes being bought for cash. So we looked into that as an indicator, as a proxy to investment activity or investor activity. Essentially, what's going on is like these firms are coming in and essentially buying these complexes, these housing and rental complexes, and sort of flipping them into like these voucher units because it's the voucher in a low-income neighborhood is more attractive to a landlord versus someone who's an unassisted renter that may not be able to meet that rent consistently like a voucher does. And obviously, a landlord needs to opt into the program as well. And once they do, like I just mentioned, they can try and get closer and closer to that rent ceiling, even if if a similar unit goes for a lot less for an unassisted renter. So one of the things we looked at is the difference between fair market rent and...
I'm sorry, Musab. We're
Yes.
having trouble hearing you again. It might be your microphone.
Okay. So let me...
Apologies.
And
maybe if you speak, and maybe if you can speak a little slower as well, that might help because it's kind of coming in and out. So thank you.
Okay. I'll try to go slower.
Thank you.
Okay. Am I clearer now? Is it bad still? Or...
There's still a little bit of static, but I think if you go slower, we might be able to catch it. And the closed captioning is picking it up too.
Okay. I'll go a bit slower. So, as I mentioned, the housing voucher subsidies are capped based on fair market rents that HUD estimates each year for housing units in a geographic area. So, for Baltimore, this is the Baltimore Metro, the Baltimore, Towson, Columbia Metro area. It encompasses a large space around Baltimore City. And so, historically, HUD established a single set of fair market rents for units of various sizes in each metro area. So these, as I said, this is a large region that encompasses more than Baltimore City. And so there's quite a bit of high opportunity, high income neighborhoods that skew the rent ceiling higher, which makes that more attractive for units for landlords seeking to rent out a unit in a low income neighborhood, low opportunity, high poverty neighborhood. And what small area fair market rent would do in our research is what it essentially is based off of is it takes it takes the zip codes for the Baltimore City area, and it takes the fair market rent at those levels rather than the entire metro area. And so you'll get more of an accurate fair market rent than that the higher, larger metro area. And so what this would do is it would raise the rent ceiling in high income, high opportunity neighborhoods, and it would lower the rent ceiling in low income, low opportunity neighborhoods, thus sort of incentivizing upward mobility to seek out better units in high opportunity neighborhoods. And with that, I will stop speaking. Hopefully you all can hear me, and I'll pass it off to Cheryl.
All right, thanks. Fingers crossed my audio behaves. So for our project, we realized that we needed to create a data tool that shows the spatial nuances of the housing market, kind of beyond the perspectives that were captured in the stakeholder interviews. So to get a greater understanding of household characteristics, we specifically focused on these key questions. So who would benefit from small area fair market rents? Where are they located? And what could this mean for recommendations? So knowing that we'd be disseminating this tool to a broad set of stakeholders, we wanted to create something that would allow for some exploratory analysis. We had some debates about looking at data at that zip code level, but ultimately chose to look at even smaller geographies, so census tracts, and see how these building blocks of community can be mapped out in relation to zip codes and counties. And we chose to take a very specific focus looking at relationships in these small areas. Next slide, please. So in creating our tool, we decided to use ArcGIS Online to host the database, and it would be powering both a map and a dashboard describing the metro area at which the current payment standards are set. So we pulled in several data sets from the most recent 5-year ACS release. So we looked at race and ethnicity, median household income, gross rent, and rental affordability. We pulled in other data sets from HUD, such as area median income and the number of housing choice vouchers, which we ended up dividing by residential properties or residential units from the ACS. We rounded out our data with some point level owner occupancy information from the Maryland Department of Planning, and lastly, proprietary home sales data from the company RB Intel, which enables us to look at cash sales, so a measure that we're using to predict investment properties compared to folks who might be buying homes with a mortgage. Next slide, please. So pulling all of this together enabled us to create this dashboard. So as I mentioned, we've got the map that shows relationships at the census tract level for the Baltimore metro area, the ability to filter areas by demographic and household characteristics, and some descriptive statistic indicators at the bottom. So let's dig into some specific components. Next slide. So first and foremost, we had decided to display our data showing the relationship between voucher use and rental affordability, or in this case, unaffordability. So this visualization technique is called a bivariate choropleth map. And so for this tool, it provides a color on the blue to orange spectrum measuring high variables, low, and areas that might have one and not the other. So our research has indicated that there's a relationship between these two variables, but there's always that constant question of where is this happening spatially? So in addition to showing the data with this overlay, we've identified census tracts that are below the area median income, or AMI. So let's take a look at this on the map. Next slide, please. So here we're zoomed in a little bit to Baltimore City, and we can see spatial concentrations of high voucher use and high rental costs in Baltimore. So these are circled in that green outline. So as we can see with that cross hatching, so those diagonal stripes that are kind of overlaying the data, many areas in the Baltimore region are actually below AMI, which for our metro area is $116,000. Next slide, please. So we have sliders on the map to enable users of the tool to display custom percentage ranges for race and ethnicity, owner occupancy, income, and rent. So when you adjust the sliders, the map and the numeric indicators at the bottom of the page update automatically. Next slide. So for this map, we have a filter on showing census tracts in the Baltimore region that are 50% or more Black African American. And as we can see in Baltimore, more than half of those majority Black communities on this map have both high rates of voucher use and high rates of rental unaffordability. Next slide. So let's take it another step further. So here we have that more than 50% Black filter on, and I've also added in owner occupancy below 50%. So in the last 20 years that my organization has been looking at and running this data, we've watched owner occupancy start decreasing in some communities as cash sales have increased in East and West Baltimore. Next slide. And so beyond the graphics on the map itself, we've created interactive pop-ups on the map. So when you select a census tract, you get all of the database variables presented. So the AMI, the gross rent, the voucher utilization, a pie chart that shows the racial and ethnic breakdown for that census tract, and also the size breakdown of housing units in that tract. Next slide, please. So altogether, this tool enables folks to understand the overall housing and demographic landscape of housing vouchers and rental unaffordability, in particular in Baltimore. So I'm going to turn it back over to Musab now. I know we're running a little late on time for some overall discussion pieces on project recommendations based on both the qualitative, so those interviews, and then this quantitative data that can be pulled out from the tool about small area fair market rents.
Yeah, and please, we only have about 2 minutes left.
Got it.
Thanks. Thank you, Cheryl. And I'll be very quick here. So our recommendations are for very smart fair market rent would be that it deconcentrates voucher holders by reducing the payment ceilings in low-income neighborhoods and increasing the affordability and the rent prices for unassisted renters. Implementing small fair market rent would incentivize moving, upward mobility by, like I said, raising the rent ceiling in higher opportunity neighborhoods, lowering it in low opportunity neighborhoods. And in theory, this could recruit new landlords as well to, like in higher opportunity neighborhoods that can give voucher holders more choice in moving to better opportunities. And with that, that concludes our presentation. Thank you all for listening, and we're happy to take questions.
So we're actually going to thank you for that great presentation. Sorry to everybody about the audio difficulties. So we're going to save our questions till the end. So the next presentation up is Natasha Moody with Keith Wiley and Lance George from the Housing Assistance Council. Title of their presentation is Demographics of Regions with a High Prevalence of Heirs Properties. Take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to take a moment here to share my screen. And Sean, would you be able to confirm, please, that you can see my slides?
Yes, can see them.
Great, thank you. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Natasha Moody. I'm here with Dr. Keith Wiley, and we are here to talk about demographics in regions with a high prevalence of heirs properties. So about the Housing Assistance Council, we're a national nonprofit that supports rural housing development and rural affordable housing and community development. We work across the country with a specific focus in persistent poverty regions and other high-need rural areas. Today, I will start with an overview of just some background about the heirs property, and then I will hand it over to Keith to talk more about how we use ACS data to analyze demographics of regions with a high prevalence. So heirs property is a term that can be used differently across the country. The ways that we looked at heirs property include a traditional definition, which is properties that have a transfer of ownership upon the owner's death without a will or some form of formal estate planning. So in that example, there's an owner, they pass away, they've not created a will or had a form of estate planning, and that property gets transferred to their descendants. The other type of property that we looked at are properties that there is estate planning, but the property was left to multiple descendants. But for some reason, those descendants were not able to complete the probate process, which is the process which officially transfers that deed to the new owners. And then throughout generations, that property becomes a tangled title and becomes a form of an heir's property. Heirs property has been created and is perpetuated by systemic issues. Some of these systemic issues include systemic exclusion of certain peoples from the financial and legal system. There may be a distrust of the legal system due to generations of exploitation and exclusion. And then particularly they're focused on rural communities. There are areas that are legal and financial deserts. They're not able to access legal aid easily or access financial institutions. All of these systemic issues contribute to the creation and perpetuation of heirs property. As I mentioned previously, there are some properties that do have forms of estate planning, but once the owner passes away, the folks who inherit the properties are not able to go through that legal process of transferring the property. In most states, that's the probate process done through the courts, and usually requires legal representation. So there are some barriers to probate which are systemic as well. There are financial constraints. So families, it can be a time-consuming and very costly process, and so that can be a barrier to be able to complete probate. When a property is left to multiple descendants, there may be some tensions within the family and familial issues that lead to not being able to get to a resolution. There may be some misunderstandings because these processes differ from state to state. You may have a descendant in one state, the home may be located in the original home may be located in a different state. And so the probate process varies, but depending on your localities, there may be a misunderstanding of what that process is and what is needed to really have that clear deed. As I mentioned earlier as well, the issue of legal deserts. In some states, the probate process requires access to the courts and legal representation. And in some communities where they don't have easy access to legal representation to the courts, this can be a barrier to probate. And this continues to perpetuate the issue and maintain there being a prevalence of heirs property. So given that these are systemic issues that have created the issues of heirs properties and perpetuate them, the communities which are systemically marginalized and excluded are disproportionately affected. So literature shows that Native American households are disproportionately affected by title issues, and there's a very unique history there of exclusion and a theft of land in the ways that have resulted in this. Black households, low-income households, farmers, ranchers, agricultural landowners, particularly Black and Native American, are disproportionately affected by this. Rural households are disproportionately affected, and also residents in colonias. And so again, because it's a systemic issue that creates and perpetuates this, we do see it does disproportionately affect the communities which are affected by these systems. There's one thing that comes across often as we discuss the issue of heirs property, that the issues arise because our system needs to have one person owning a property with a clear title most times to be able to access the equity in the home and to be able to really take advantage of the benefits of being a homeowner, a property owner in this country. But there are families and cultures which communal and familial land ownership is a part of how they succeed as a community. So there may be folks who are intentionally leaving their land to multiple descendants, and our system does not allow for there to be an easy process for those folks to be able to still access the equity and the benefits of being property owners. There are communal approaches to land stewardship that are counter to, some of the ways that our systems work. Various communities have cultural ties to the land. Historically, land ownership has been a point of political agency in our country. There's cultural stewardship, and there are folks who would like to keep their kin tied to their original land. And so, there are reasons why folks may choose to leave their land to multiple folks. However, the way our system is designed, there may be extra challenges for folks to be able to retain a clear title to the property and be able to really access the full benefits of land ownership that are tied to our financial systems. And so the implications of this issue is that with heirs property, regions with a high prevalence of heirs properties, because the owners without the clear deed cannot access the financial systems, cannot get loans to do repair, sometimes can struggle to get disaster relief aid, are not able to sell the property without the clear deed, or to even access equity in the land. We may see dilapidation and vacancy in areas with a high prevalence of heirs property. The families who own this land may have a loss of generational wealth, or may be living on the land in substandard living conditions because they're unable to access the loans to be able to do repairs. On a community level, communities may have a loss of a tax base and loss of property tax revenue because the values of these properties are not able to be kept up, sold, so on and so forth. The property taxes that they can collect from these properties will be lower. Communities may experience outmigration and a declining population, and while being able to do this analysis of using the ACS data to look at what are some common characteristics and trends in regions with a high prevalence of heirs property, can allow municipalities to maybe create targeted approaches to how to address this issue, aid the households, and aid the overall community. So I'm going to turn it over to Keith to speak more about our use of the ACS data.
Thanks, Natasha. And I'm just going to talk here a little bit, again, provide the kind of some descriptive analysis that we did using the ACS on areas where the heirs property are more prevalent. And I'm going to talk here first about the methods and how we approached this. And we basically relied on previous research indicators and results. And we used that along with some other data to identify counties with a high prevalence of heirs. We essentially classified counties that then we would look at the characteristics with comparing those areas. And what we did was, I'll talk about that in a second, the categories, but then we focused on the Southeast. And that's because there was a lot of prior research there, and it had been there due to the concentration of heirs in the Black Belt and Black agricultural land. And in particular, we focus here on 3 states, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. And what we did was we conducted a demographic analysis using the ACS. And there's essentially 2 ways the ACS is often used to study this. And some people just use the ACS in general and look at measures like poverty and stuff to identify areas where they think the heirs are going to be. And then there's other stuff like what we're doing is more based on, we identify the areas ahead of time based on property data, and then we use the ACS that describe them. And what I'm going to do here is, so it's very useful with data to help with this. The ACS is very important. And what I'm going to do is just talk about some of the trends or the patterns we found. And it's going to be very similar to what Natasha was talking about in the background. So what we did was we classified counties based on the likely prevalence of heirs using those other research and measures and some additional data. And we essentially kind of broke it up into quintiles. So we'd have some variation, like areas where it would be a low prevalence, a very low prevalence, a low prevalence, then moderate, high, and very high prevalence. Essentially, this is like the proportion of housing stock that we think is likely to be heirs in the county. And what we're looking for is variation in key measures between those that you kind of associate with heirs and some of the attributes that we've talked about. And here's the first, it's been a while since I've been able to give pie charts into one presentation, but one of the indicators we looked at, and this important one, is race and ethnicity. And here we use the ACS 2021 data. And there's 2 pie charts. One is, and it's an aggregate. So the first one, all 3 states, is the distribution of the population by race and Hispanic or Latino ethnicity. And you can see we combined some categories. And it says like 21.2% of the population is Black or African American, non-Hispanic, and 18.6% is Hispanic. And then right next to it is the very high prevalence county and aggregate their share. And you can see 2 things stand out. The larger share of Black or African American population in the high prevalence areas, it's about 34%. And if we were to break this out by category, you would see it constantly increases with the prevalence, which is what the literature would say. And another thing that's, I think, a little bit unique here is you see the Hispanic population is actually higher in general for the 3 states at 18.6 than it is for the very high prevalence areas where it's just 5.5. I think this reflects two things. One, there's a lower prevalence in Florida for the data that we looked at, and also that a lot of times these are newer residents going into newer areas, or they may be more renters and there's less prevalence. But this would vary and look different if you looked at other parts of the country, like the border colonies. It would change, and if you look, say, in the Great Plains, Native American lands, it would change. But this is kind of what we expect. And then we looked at another aspect of it that's been talked about is rurality. And so what we did is pretty simple. Here we took the blue bars are the populations for the three states by metropolitan area county. And so essentially metropolitan area is suburban and exurban and urban. And that is 90% of the population live in the suburban urban areas for these three states. And only 9% or 10% live outside of metropolitan area, which is rural. But if we look at the high, and it should be very high prevalence areas, almost half of the population is outside a metropolitan area. And if you actually looked at counties, a majority of the high prevalence areas would be rural. So this just kind of confirms this. It doesn't mean that there are more ARES properties necessarily in rural areas. It's just more common. You might have more units maybe in a place like Miami, for instance, but there may be small rural counties in Florida where it's a higher percentage of the units are ARES. And another characteristic we looked at is persistent poverty. That's counties that have had 20% or high poverty for 3 decades, 2000, 2010, and 2020. Here we use the FHFA. I think I got that right, persistent poverty indicator. There's a couple of them now, but this is related to the duty to serve. And again, it's counties with 3 decades of 20% or higher poverty. And there are 72 of them in these 3 states, and you can see them in this map. And of those 72, it's pretty remarkable. 21 were essentially would be a high prevalence ARES, and 31 would be a very high prevalence ARES. So about 52 of these counties would fall into one of those higher prevalence. And it kind of backs up what we're saying. It's kind of it's part of a process, and actually it's probably like a feedback loop where this even makes things worse because then you can't sell a property and stuff like that. And so it creates problems in these areas that are kind of struggling already. And the next slide looks at population change. And here I did break it out. We broke it out by the prevalence. And you can see, I think this is really good. All that we did was we aggregated the population in the very low prevalence counties, for instance, for 2010 and then for 2020. And you can see there's a direct relationship here. Very low prevalence, those are areas that grew, and they were more economically vibrant. But then you look at the very high prevalence, and they were areas that actually declined population-wise. And again, this would dovetail with the other measures like persistent poverty. And so it's kind of just that some of these are kind of startling. It really confirms what you would expect given the research. And one of the last ones, and I've presented on this topic before, is broadband subscription. We do a lot of that in rural areas, talk about that issue. And this is just the ACS measure. So it's not that necessarily that you didn't have access, although I'd suggest it's probably correlated with that or relatively closely. But this is households by lack of subscription. And you can see it's almost 25%, 23%, almost a quarter in the very high prevalence ARES counties areas compared to 13.8 overall. And if we take it out to the categories, again, once more, you see a direct relationship. And this kind of fits right with what Natasha was saying with like the infrastructure and the limits. And this is kind of like, it's like a systematic thing, right? So now there's ARES property and people can't get loans to fix it up. And so these things all contribute. And it's likely it also this is reflecting some that there may be older residents there, but it's also probably reflecting a lack of wealth, a lack of resources, and a lack of infrastructure, which is also, again, related to these other issues. And I always find this one fascinating and kind of troubling, particularly given things like COVID. And we know the importance.
We have about 1 minute left, please.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it right up. Sorry, yeah, no, I can run on sometimes, but I think this is very important, that there's inherent risks in this type of research, and you don't always get that in social sciences. But when you identify ARES parcels, particularly if you went to the census tract or lower, part of the issue would be that you might increase an opportunity for exploitation because if people see this, what could happen is there's multiple owners. Maybe there's, say, 50 owners. Somebody could go in and buy essentially the interest from a couple people and force the sale of a property. And that's happened. And you can unfortunately end up in, say, there's minerals to be exploited or timber or something. You don't want to put information out there that could then be used by nefarious characters, quite frankly. And we're always concerned about that. And then also this, just to note, this is related to other systematic exclusion, and it's all, I think, part of a whole system that holds these communities back. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, and we look forward to discussion at the end of all the presentations. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that presentation. And we'll now move on to our last presentation entitled The Effect of Alternative Income Measures on Housing Affordability Metrics by Douglas White and Mary Lewis White.
All right, thanks for having me. First, before I start, hopefully you're seeing my slides. Yes, they seem to be showing up now. Before I start, anything I say here, I'm speaking for myself, not the university. So I always like to start with that. And so, yeah, my presentation here is going to be the effect of alternative income measures on housing affordability. Specifically, what we're going to look at is how, if we change how we calculate area median income, what does that do to housing affordability? So we'll talk about the goals, go through the methodology really quickly, and then talk about the results. So basically, if you look at housing affordability, almost everyone uses HUD's area median income that they report. And what's interesting about that, or at least I find it interesting, is that when HUD calculates that area median income, they only use family households. So they exclude non-family households, and they do it for both owners and renters. Well, I've always kind of wondered, what would happen if instead of taking family households, what if we took all households? And since we're talking about renter affordability, what would happen if we limited the sample to finding like a renter affordable or renter area median income instead of using everyone? So originally our approach was to look at 4 different measures using HUD's current approach, then using HUD's approach, but using all household income rather than family income. And then we were going to limit it to renter family income and renter household income. But turns out when you limit it to renters, whether you use family income or household income, there's not really a statistical difference between those incomes you find. So what we're going to do then is just look at these 3 different ones using HUD's approach, which is family and all households. Then we're going to look at what happens if you use household income for all households and what happens if you use just a renter family household. And so the reasoning behind this is if you look in Louisiana, where I am, 57 of our 64 parishes, family income is statistically higher than non-family income, with a mean difference of about 13,000 and a max difference of about 22. So there's a pretty significant, we can be looking at pretty large differences. And in 63 or 64 of the parishes, what we're going to see is that owner income is statistically higher than renter. And here it tends to be quite different. The mean difference is approximately 32,500, and the maximum difference is about 64,000. So what we're going to do is basically mirror HUD's approach. We're going to basically create metropolitan statistical areas as best we can using the 2021 PUMS data. Once we've created those areas, we're going to calculate the area median income. Then we're going to group our renters. We're going to group our rental units. We're going to look at how well they match. So we'll determine the availability. We're also going to look at how well the housing market sorts. So we're going to look at affordability and availability. And if you're not familiar with PUMS data, although I'm guessing most of you are, basically this is your public use file so that you're not tied to the tabular data, and basically it's going to be a geographical area that contains at least 100,000 people. It's built on census tracts and counties, and it should be geographically contiguous. And as you can see in Louisiana, we're able to create basically 9 what we're going to call study areas. They're basically based on the MSAs, and they do a relatively good job, especially for the big ones. Shreveport-Bossier, we have 1 extra parish or county. New Orleans is identical, and Baton Rouge is pretty identical as well. So works pretty well for calculating or creating these MSAs. And so within these different study areas, what you'll see, again, one of the reasons I think we should maybe think about limiting income to just renters and using all households is that you'll see that in all these areas, there's a few where renter households are a greater percentage of family, but in most areas it's about 50-50. So again, this just is motivating that idea that why are we only using families to calculate income rather than all households? So then what we're going to do is we're going to calculate that MSA median income. So we're going to do it 3 ways, right? We're going to do it the HUD way, taking just family households. Then we're going to take all households. And then we're going to take the renter family only households. We'll get that area median income. What HUD does then is set that as the median income for a 4-person household. We're going to then, based on your household size, we're going to weight the income you need. So if you're a 1-person household, you only need to make 70% of that to have the area median income. 2 people, 80%, so forth. This is another advantage of the PUMS data is that we could take households, we could take the actual household size and put them in their proper AMI category. So what we're going to do then is we're going to group renters into what's extremely low income, which is you're making 30% or less of area median income, very low income, which is 50% or less, and then low income, which is 80% or less area median income. We're able to do a similar thing to calculate the number of rental units that are affordable. So we're going to take the rental units, we're going to figure out, are you affordable? And by affordable, what that means is you shouldn't be cost burdened. So no more than 30% of your income would go to that rent. So we're able to figure out if a unit's affordable at 30% or less area median income, 50% or less, or 80% or less. So then we just group. So we have renters, we have household, or we have apartments or rental units that are available. We're able to combine those two to see, do we have enough units for renters? Do we have more renters than units? That'll give us our housing surplus or shortage above these different incomes. I should add here, when we figure out the rent, we're using the PUMS data again. We're taking the gross rent and we're adding to that electric, fuel, gas, and water as reported in the PUMS data. We're also weighting that based on the number of bedrooms. So again, advantage to the PUMS data is that you know the number of bedrooms in the unit, so you can do a better measure than if you're relying on just, gross rent chart tables that are available in the tabular data. You don't know if there's 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, or so forth. So when we do that, what we're able to see, here's the different AMIs that you get. So if you look, it can be anywhere. So the HUD approach in the Alexandria area is 53,000, and it goes down to, if you just use renter family income, to about 31,000. So I'm going to use New Orleans and Shreveport as the 2 I talk about, because 1, I'm based in Shreveport, and 2, if you talk about Louisiana, everyone knows New Orleans. But you can see here, there's a rather drastic difference in area median incomes. In New Orleans, using the HUD approach, it's about 73.5. If you only use renters, it's down to about 40. And in Shreveport, you can see it's almost half here, that the HUD approach is 60,000, and using just renters, it's down to 32,000. And again, I also think this is important because what we're going to see is when we start looking at some of these values, the numbers say, hey, we don't have a problem. But when you talk to renters, renters are always like, yeah, I can't ever find any place that's affordable. So I think this might explain maybe some of that disconnect we're seeing. So also, if we convert these then into rents, so if we look at it like a 2-bedroom apartment, this tells you what your 2-bedroom monthly rent would be, what would be affordable under these different approaches. And, you can see here, if you look at New Orleans, if you're low income, making 80% of AMI, HUD says you can afford about $13,000 towards 2-bedroom rent. Whereas if we were using all households, that would only be about $1,000. If we were using renter family income, we're down to $719. So you can see this is going to have a drastic effect on what's affordable. So if we start doing this, and now we're going to figure out, where these fall, what you can see here is if we do this, what you'll see is this is the extremely low income. Using the HUD approach, what we have is about 21,500 units that are affordable. But if you go down or you're just using renter family income, what you're going to see is that those number of affordable units drops down to about 10,000. If you look at rental households, what you'll see here is that with 30% or less, that under the HUD approach, it's about 51,000. If we just use renter families, it's down to about 25. The interesting thing here is that while the surplus deficit is different, if you break this down into the number of units that are affordable per 100 tenants, they're pretty similar, 42, 41, 41. Where really, so the jump to the conclusions, the real takeaway is no matter how you define income, if you're extremely low income, making 30% or less, nowhere do we have enough units. Just doesn't matter how you define income, we're not going to have enough units for you. Where we start to see changes here is when we start to get to this very low income at 50%. You can see here that again, affordable units per 100 under HUD approach is 58. Under the renter family income, it's down to 39. Where I think this really gets interesting is when you talk about the affordable at 80%. So this would be low income households. It looks like we have a surplus. So we have about 129 units per 100 tenants. But yet, if we're using just renter family income, what you're going to see is that that's really only 49. So again, this is where I think we get some of this disconnect when people are talking about, but the numbers say we have plenty of units that are affordable. We don't need to build any more affordable units. Yet it might be because of the way we're actually defining what the affordability is, what that area median income is. If you're a renter family here, great, we're saying we have enough units, but reality is you're facing that we only have about half the units that we say that we need to have these units be affordable. We also take this a step further. We look at availability. Markets don't perfectly sort, right? So some housing units will rent down because they want to save money. Some housing units will rent up because they want to be in a better school district or a safer neighborhood or whatever. So what we'll see is, I would encourage people to rent down because you're able to save money. But every time somebody rents down, that's going to take away a unit that's actually available for a household that would otherwise need that unit in that category. So what we'll see here is if we do that, what happens then is that you'll see that if we look at affordable and available units, they're always lower than what we'd see if we just looked at affordable. Again, at the extremely low income 30%, it's not shocking that we have, again, differences. But again, 50%, the affordable available, is about half of what it was under using just renter income. And again, at the 80% level, again, this is where I think it's really kind of jumps out is that, using the HUD approach, we still have a shortage of units because we only have 91 that are affordable and available per 100 tenants. But if you look at just using renter income, that drops to 34. So again, this is just kind of summarizing that, reporting it in case you thought I picked New Orleans just because the results were bad. You'll see that in Shreveport-Bossier, we get similar results. So again, the whole reason I'm doing this is that, and this is the available and affordable. The whole point I'm doing this is I think it really makes a big difference how we define what that area median income is, which is then basing whether something's affordable off it. So I think we need to maybe rethink or at least expand how we talk about what's affordable, and maybe maybe rethink how we do this, or at least start presenting more than just one approach. So when we say this is what we have, well, if we change how we define the affordable or how we define that area median income, this is the effect it has on all these measures that we use to talk about whether something's affordable. Other things that if the thing that really drives this results, the thing that jumps out to me is because obviously when you change that area median income, it doesn't just affect the number of renters that fall in there, it affects the number of units that are going to be, since everything's based on that area median income. And so what we'll see is if you look at this, what we're seeing is that The results appear to be driven by a greater loss of affordable units compared to the renters. So while renters in that category are going down, when we lower the income, rents are coming down as well. But there's a vast difference in the way that our rental units are being distributed, that while we may lose, 10,000 renters, what we're losing is then 20,000 units that would be considered affordable. So this is what I really want to do next, is try and examine how our rents are clustered and how that drives the loss of affordable units. So what I'm thinking is that and since these results are consistent, so I only talked about Louisiana here. We haven't used the 2021 ACS data for other states yet, but we did the 2019 data for the 6 states in the Atlanta Fed region. So Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana, and I'm forgetting somebody. Similar results, that we saw the same results. Again, doesn't matter if you're extremely low income, nobody has enough units, but once you start getting to 50 and 80, that we'd see the results. And again, it was because we were losing more units than we were losing renters. And so what this is telling me is that, rents are being set based on something else, probably cost of building, some sort of rate of return. I don't know exactly what, but what we're seeing is that these rents are clustered, and it really doesn't have a lot to do with where our renters are clustered. So, so we need to unpack that a little bit. And then also, we do get some weird results in some of the kind of more rural areas. So, so I would, my thought is that this maybe is a better analysis for more urban areas than rural analysis. But again, something that needs a little more, needs a deeper dive on before I can really say that. So that's what I have for you guys, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask during the question and answer session, or send me an email. And if you want more information on the methodology, we do have a paper that looks at just calculating affordability, availability for the state, that has a really detailed methodology section that I'd be happy to share with anyone who'd want it. So thanks for having me.
All right, thank you, Doug. So we're ready to move to the Q&A session here. We've got about 13 minutes, running a little bit over, but not too bad. So please post questions in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. So I want to do first question for Adam. Question was, I think this is a question for you. The unit costs had a big jump between 2017 and 2018, from 3 to 4.3. Did you have time to examine that? And if so, what were the causes?
Yeah, so it's something that's probably not really directly relative to my research, but if you think about, so these costs are just for the Housing Choice Voucher Program, in which tenants lease privately owned rental housing. So holding all else equal, you kind of expect the per unit cost to go up in line with the cost of rent, which over the 2010s until we get to very recently was about 3% each year. So actually, if you look even before those years, what you would see at the beginning part of the decade is that there was negative growth and then very flat growth. And that was because there were cuts to program funding. This is a discretionary program. Congress determines the overall amount of funds. So what I think happened is that once sequestration, is what those cuts were called, ended in the second part of the decade, you had some catch-up growth of 4% to make up for those earlier years when per unit costs were lagging behind actual rental market costs.
All right, thanks, Adam. Next question for Natasha and team. And the question is, are immigrant households also considered marginalized in the context of heirs property transfers?
Thanks, Sean. Absolutely. And so I think that I should first start by prefacing that our presentation today was focused more on the Southeast because that's where the majority of the research has been conducted in estimating the prevalence of heirs property. And so in some of the metropolitan regions, particularly maybe, for example, like South Florida, where there may be high immigrant populations, the issue of heirs may not show up in terms of relative prevalence in those regions because of the large amount of units and so on and so forth. But if the research extends over to, particularly like the border colonias, areas more in the West, we would definitely see a prevalence of this issue among immigrant populations because of the various accessibility issues when it comes to the financial and legal system as well. And also, particularly with the border colonias, there's issues of who owns the land and also the unit on top, and that becomes even more complicated there. But essentially, yes, the immigrant population is included in that marginalized communities.
A follow-up, you kind of answered this, but are there any states that stand out as more complicated to you all when considering transferring property to heirs? Or similar, are there more states are there states that are more aggressive at seeking out potential heirs relative to other states?
Thank you. So to answer your last question first, because that's what's present on my mind, sorry, in terms of, you said, are there states that are more aggressive?
Yeah, states that are more aggressive at seeking out potential heirs versus some states that maybe just don't have their act together as much or don't put as many resources towards that.
So there's legislation that's trying to be passed. It's on a state level, the UHPH, it's the United Partition of Heirs Act. And so that is supposed to be a form of protection for heirs property owners and to allow them more protections against forced sales and exploitation to remove their land. So the states that have passed that, and excuse me, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head as of today. Last I looked, there was probably about 15 states that had passed it, but please don't quote me on that. Those states may be the ones that are more progressive in putting attention to the issue. In terms of complications in transfer of title, I may have to refer to the legal the attorneys in each state for that because it really changes from state to state and county to county how this process works. So unfortunately, there isn't a specific answer to that, but I do know that there are localities in Texas that allow for there to be a transfer of ownership outside of the courts. So I have heard that from some practitioners. They've been able to use affidavits on that transfer, which is unique. Most other states require the probate process in courts. But I unfortunately, I'm not an attorney, but we have heard from practitioners and our attorneys that we work with that it is complicated across the board.
Okay, thank you. Doug, a couple questions for you. Could you speak to any requirements or options HUD has to revise the AMI methodology? Is HUD mandated to use the methodology currently in place, or are states and localities allowed to use another measure and still qualify for federal housing funds?
So as far as I know, I haven't heard of any discussion about changing how AMI is calculated. The interesting thing is, so I'm trying to turn this into like a real paper. I have some students working with me that I'm like, you guys go do the lit review because nobody likes doing the lit review, right? And I was like, so you go do the lit review and I'll show you guys how we do this, put your names on it. And the honest truth is we can't really find any like written documentation about why family income's used versus all households.
I'll tell you.
So
I was wondering if Adam might have some insight into that.
Yeah, so I was going to hit him up for that.
Yeah, so it's 42 U.S. Code 1437A, which is what defines income limits, and median family income defines it as median family income. The term low-income families means those families whose incomes do not exceed 80% of the median income for the area. The term very low income families means low-income families whose incomes do not exceed 50% of the median family income for the area. So there you go.
As far as other states, if you're using federal funds, my understanding is you're tied to the HUD definition, but local programs, they can define AMI or they can define affordability however you want. I do some research with the Schemberg Center down in Florida, We do some work with the Florida Housing Finance Corporation. I'm pretty sure they've upped their rental assistance to cost burden is 40% rather than 30%, because basically if they limit it to 30%, too many households are still going to be, severely impacted. So, it's, as far as like federal rules, I think you're tied to HUD, but states, local programs, they have more flexibility. They can change what they want. Again, I'm not trying to say HUD's doing this wrong. I'm just, it's one of these things I've always been having in the back of my mind. Why are we putting owners in when we're talking about renters? Especially when we know renter income is significantly different than owner income. So really, my question's more like, can we, let's be innovative. Let's think outside the box. Let's, what might be a good measure in one area may not be a good measure in another area. I don't know if it would hold up statistically, but you can use the PUMS data. You could divide renter households by race or ethnicity, so you could see, if you calculated things differently, how would that affect it? So again, not saying it would necessarily be stronger or better, but just like trying to ask questions to get people to think. Let's look outside the box a bit and think, how can we best serve our local communities?
All right.
Can I make a comment on this issue? Is that, so as I talked a lot about in my presentation, HUD's rental assistance programs set rents at the 30% level of a specific household's income. So if a household qualifies for a HUD, as a low-income family, it doesn't matter that the low-income limit is like 60 grand a year. If that household makes 20 grand a year, they're only going to be paying 30% of 20 grand. Where you're using these AMIs to set rents is mostly in the low-income housing tax credit program, which is not a HUD program. HUD thinks of its median family incomes as determining eligibility for assistance. So obviously there are major consequences if you were to lower income limits and potentially remove a lot of households from being eligible for assistance. So I think thinking outside the box is definitely the way to go, but that really applies to how you design these programs and what you're using to design affordability, because as I said, HUD looks at the cost burden at the household level.
Adam, another question for you. Coming out of the pandemic or post-pandemic, have you been able to use the match data to detect any lingering employment impacts or fundamental employment shifts post-pandemic, or is that going to take a few years to be able to detect any of that?
We have not looked at the matched data to do that. I mean, we are seeing that there is reasonably strong income growth for that portion of, our assisted portfolio that is working, because, once we got through the first year and a half of COVID and the labor market got really tight again, a lot of the wage growth that has been happening in the economy is at that lower end now. So that's kind of interesting to see happen now. But there's probably more stuff to look at with the match data in terms of that too.
Okay. Doug, another question. Is there any way to capture the impact of public benefits, I'm assuming public benefit programs, on incomes for low-income households in the ACS? And a note is, the questioner said, I'm sure we still do not have enough affordable units, but I'm curious how much of a difference this might make.
Right. So my understanding is if those benefits are like cash benefits, those are supposed to be recorded as part of the household or family income in the PUMS data, that when they report that income. Something like rent transfers probably would not, I don't think would show up as in the income. So it would probably affect and change the income for some of those low households. But my understanding is that the ACS tries to take into account, so cash benefits or like food stamp kind of benefits, I think, are supposed to be incorporated into the income data that's being reported as the household or family income. But I would have to go back and check the ACS definition to be 100% sure on that answer. But I'm I'm pretty sure that at least some of the benefits are being captured in there.
Okay. All right. Well, we are at time here at 2:50. So I want to thank all of our presenters for a great session here. Thank you for your efforts. Great presentations, good discussion, and just great to see everybody continuing to use the valuable resource that is the ACS. So thank you to the presenters, and I wish everybody has a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.